this word love is being defined in so many ways for us and on our behalf as people. It's just like, no, love, empathy is love, and that is the way you express it, is how we just talked about it. But we've also recently, in a different sermon, you mentioned some stuff. The sermon is literally in the same sermon series. It is the Bring Me Another Jar, and we're going through the 3 theological virtues, and we did one on love. Mm-hmm. And you talked about love in the defining of love, and we talked about how you said God is love, mm-hmm. but love is not God, and you were going after something when you said that, and you were kind of going after this, like this idea that if we, when we look at something, if we agree with it or disagree with it, we'll ascribe that it's loving or not loving, or if I wouldn't do it that way, so therefore it's not loving type of thoughts and our feelings. You drew this diagram that I felt like was so helpful, and I kind of want to explain it. Yeah. If there's people listening to this, they'll be watching it, but some might be watching it, but listening to it. And but anyways, we can lay out that diagram here in a second. But it's basically like there is so much going on in the world right now and telling me how I am allowed to love people and what love is and how to define that term. But you talked about how, no, God is love. And when we get a clear understanding of him, we can get a clear understanding of what love is. And you went after our thoughts and feelings, I feel like, a little bit with that diagram. Like, hold on, but how, if something doesn't feel loving to me, this is the question I have. If something doesn't feel loving to me, but God says it's love, or it is something he's done, and now I'm realizing he is love is not him, how do I deal with that? So you showed us in this diagram, so I guess I can just explain it, because I've referenced it enough now. But you started out with God, and you started out in the beginning God, so he's there first, and then you talked about creation, time, man, creation, all the other elements in creation, and then you talked about how man thinks is in there several layers in to a part of the creation is earth. Earth is a part of the whole, and then on that earth there's humans, and then one of the things humans do is think and feel things. Yeah. And so if we think and feel something is not loving, getting all the way back to the top, you just pointed out the fact that we got to start with the fact that this is several layers into what God the Creator has created, and so we can't take our thoughts and feelings as fact in those moments on this is love or isn't love. But if something comes across our plate or our minds or our feelings, that is so hard to understand how a loving God would do something like that. How do we deal with that? And that's really my question. I know it's open-ended, but that's my first question. I have a couple more. We even had one shared with us. Right. But how do we begin to deal with, but it doesn't seem loving in all that I know in my human experience? Yeah. This thing that God did or someone said or whatever.
Totally.
How do we deal with that?
Yeah, that's great. So I think what it comes back to is I mentioned, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am.
Right.
And the postmodern extrapolation on that is I think, therefore I am right.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Everything I think is right.
Because I think.
Yeah. If I have a thought, it's right. Okay. And it's right because I thought it.
Right.
So Descartes was talking about existence. What does it mean to be real?
Right.
And he boiled it down to the way I know I'm real is because I think.
Okay.
I have thoughts. Therefore I know I exist. And we've taken that and it's how do I know what is true?
Right.
Not just, it was just similar to, what's real, but what is truth? And so in postmodernism, it's, I know what is true based on what I think.
Right.
Whatever I think is true, that's true. So I think, therefore I'm right.
Yes.
Because I thought it. I'm right about it. And that's the same thing as saying, I think, therefore I am God.
Okay.
Because I define reality.
I define what's right.
My thoughts define reality. Okay. My thoughts define what is true and all of that. So the world that we're living in. That's the momentum of the flow. That's the river we're in every day. Like everything is moving in that direction. And so we've really got to, it's helpful to be aware of that and understand, I talked about this last February. Like, if following Jesus and believing the word of God doesn't feel like you're swimming upstream, you're probably not doing it.
Okay.
And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, it's like, maybe a good one-liner or whatever. But I'm like, no, I really do mean it. Like, I'm not, it's not a one-liner. It's like, no, let's wake up here and understand, like, the general flow of the world we're living in is not moving us in the general direction of truth and God.
Okay.
It is moving us far away.
Interesting. Yes.
So, okay, so we can get asked, or I can get asked, well, how could a loving God do this?
Right.
Or allow this? I can't believe in a God who would do this or that.
Okay.
That's
what I'm talking about.
Yeah, totally. And it's like, man, because this is a really real hard thing, suffering in the world, hell, my whatever, like hardship thing, man. It's like real life that are just terrible. It's like, gosh, if God's good, if God's loving, how is there suffering in the world? It's kind of back to that whole big question, a general, or what am I trying to say? That big question, if God's good, how is there suffering in the world?
Right.
Kind of all the nuanced outworkings of that question is essentially what we're talking about.
Yes.
Or I'm a Christian, but I don't believe this and that doctrine because it doesn't seem loving to me, and God is love.
Yeah, that's another way it plays out.
So that's more the deconstruction sort of thing that's happening now. So the atheist thing kind of goes down the road of, if God's good, how could there be suffering? If God's real and good, how could there be suffering? Sort of the whatever. Yeah. The deconstruction thing. I don't know how else to label it. Is like, no, I'm a Christian. I just don't hold to this doctrine because I don't see how that's loving. Yeah. So what we have to do, so my whole point is we've got to be aware of the jumps that we're making when we draw conclusions sometimes and the blind spots that we have in our thought processes. That's good. So for me to say, I can ask the question, God, how is what you did loving? Because I don't understand. That's great. Okay. God, I'm coming to you because I want to know more. Yes. I'm assuming you're right, God. I'm assuming you're real, God. Yeah. I'm assuming that it was loving. Right. I just don't get it. Right. So I need to be taught here. That's great. That's very different than I reject God or God's not like that because God is love. Okay. And love is what I define it as. Right. Yeah. And that doesn't line up with my definition of love. Right. Okay. Which means either God didn't do it or God's not real. Right. And it's like, okay, we're making some really bold claims here. And so if we're going to believe in God, then he has to be God and we are not. Right. Which means he knows things we don't know. Right. Which means we're the ones that need to be asking questions humbly, not putting him on trial. Right. And those are two different things. You can kind of ask the same question two different ways, but it's a very different question, Yes. So, I don't know.
That's helpful. Yeah, it's helpful. What I hear you saying is kind of like what we learned in the Biblical Formation series. One way of asking questions there, you're keeping him at the center of everything and saying, I don't understand this, but I'd like some help understanding. The other is at different moments in your life, removing him from the center, you standing back in the center and saying, I wouldn't do it this way, so tell me why this is the way you're doing it.
Right. So it's two different thought processes. Right. The one that we're disposed to, or is that the right way I'm using that word? I think it is. The one that we lean towards is, okay, I'm God. Right. And I have thoughts, and those thoughts are correct. So I know what love is. Yeah. Because I have thoughts about that.
Therefore,
what God said or did or didn't say or didn't do doesn't fit into my definition of love. Right. Which means God is wrong or God's not real or so God's not God.
You draw conclusions.
God's not God. Yeah. So
that's good.
That's the thought. That's one thought process. The other thought process starts with, okay, God is. God is love. Right. Okay, God said or didn't say or did or didn't do XYZ thing. Mm-hmm. So XYZ thing was loving. Mm-hmm. I just don't understand it.
Right.
So, God, will you please teach me about you?
Yeah, and you did that.
Yeah,
you kind of took us through that in the sermon.
So that's what I'm trying to get at here is that's the more properly ordered thought process.
Right. So, to go back to my original question, like, so what do we do? I'm tempted to hear in this moment just like, well, just deal with it. Swallow the pill.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely not what I'm saying.
I know.
When we have questions, we've got to go to God.
Right.
We have to go to God as God. Not as God. We have to go to God as humans.
Right.
And he is God.
Right.
And so we come to learn and we come to be taught.
Yes.
And we come humbly. We don't come to put God on trial and stand against him in pride and arrogance in that way. And that's how we get to revelation.
Yes.
Which is awesome.
Right. And so you're saying like our part to play in this process of dealing with the things we see is going to him and hearing from him.
Right.
It very similarly to the last question I asked. We're designed to go to him and flow with his life, to be filled with him and to hear from him in with all of those questions.
Yes.
And that begins to paint the picture of like, okay, so I am, as a follower, I am predominantly going to him and following as a believer.
Yeah, and as it pertains to love,
right.
We talked about this with empathy, but it's the same thing with love. Like we're getting taught definitions of that all the time.
Right.
And so it means we have to come to God to learn what love is.
Right.
And so he teaches me love through himself, not through my opinions and through what the world says and what somebody tells me was or wasn't loving.
Yes.
Or my own feelings about love or my thoughts about love or your feelings about love and thoughts about love. That's not the authority on what love is.
Yes. Right.
So it's hard, and all that stuff, but we've got to decide how we're living our lives. Like, he's either God or he's not, and I'm following him or I'm not.
Okay.
And so now I've got to follow him, and as it pertains to what is and isn't love and what is and isn't loving, my primary authority isn't your thoughts and feelings about me and what I did or didn't do or all those sort of things. I've got to come to him and be taught by him, and that's really the point that we're trying to make, is we understand love by understanding God, because God is love.
That's right.
Love is not God, meaning my ideas about love do not shape who God really is.
Right.
What is really true about love is defined by what God says.
Right.
And I'm here to learn about that.
To learn what he says.
So we would do well to just start the conversation assuming we know nothing.
Right. That's so true.
We've got to come to the conversation saying, I don't assume that I know or understand anything about what love really is, where it really comes from, what it really looks like. That's where I'm coming to start.
Yes. Yes.